Mythical line rotations, high set lines, and calculation screen interference. The inner child is high force in its screen lines. Coming in the mystical cortex of design, guys. That's all lines of communication what comes into the matrix locations. I did that at Space Discoveries, okay, episode 5, where it basically tells you exactly what goes on when you get into the connections of the visionary cortex of design, the placebo cortex of design, the mystical cortex. It's all lines and methodical. And that methodical becomes its memory line that identifies all settings of its system. So it's really understanding the identifications, right? You're starting with the I9 of 6 in line calculation setting, how to direct your signals, all of your travels, so your inner child can get a deeper core on its mystical setting, its location of its adventure. Okay, it's like a never-ending story. That's basically what it is. When Atreyu was basically trying to figure out what's going on, like, is he the cause of this effect? His application, the whole time was actual, the narrator was the boy. The boy is the one that could basically set everything free. That's what it was. That was the distraction, right? There's so many lines of looking at that through that settings. So it's very powerful when you come into the inner child of mystical line connection. Okay. So in line provision cycles, we're going to direct lines of communication to your settings. Teams lines of interference is 19,000 line setting. The correlation lines track line side division location of species has the direct locations when they come into that system, which is fifth dimension, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, that's where they are in 2030. But the mind line is in 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. That's the balance they need. And their part accelerator in line calculation setting is 200,000 line settings. All right. That's position location is RPMI. That line is its location ramifications to its setting. So putting lines of programs, lines of identifications, I9 lines 6 and 9 lines of 8, puts all laws of prodigal settings and travels. It directs their signals and location your systems. All travels are recognition, and line communications operates in line cycle. Puts all communication near settings and trashes. So the information panels and line condition mapping sequence coordinates line connections to your pi. Directs lines that calculation screen lines high interference. So again, this is a deeper core of the inner child. The only difference is your connection your settings into all levels comes into higher definition. Now, when you come into the information locations, it comes in a calculation line centers location to HDMI. Okay? So in that line on interference, you have to understand how that works with higher in definition location of minds, of its memory, of its identifications. HDMI. Okay? Now you understand the position of wires and how it's so important to understand your track locations, where you're coming from your vision line to really understand how to direct line his allocations. You got 2 lines of communication setting to its program that puts everything in provision lines of cycles and track location your settings, all levels of travel mechanisms. So that gives you power over line screen, powers over pi, powers over directions over pi track location. So there's so many ways of looking at it, right? So it's a deeper core of you inside through the inner child, but it's on a mystical line setting of a cortex of design that puts the placebo effect in line condition setting. So it high rises your endorphins. Now, when you understand the spectrum communication line screens when it comes into the eclipse, what it is servicing, I'll show you exactly what its instructions. I line setting, here's the I. Okay, I line setting. Setting lines of communication of the sun and position of the moon. Okay, 2 track locations. All right, so what's going to happen? The actual moon is going to cross over the sun in settings. The sun's going to cross over the moon, direct and redirect. So what's going to happen? It's going to create a dimensional sail. And when it creates a dimensional sail, it's going to create a solar screen and direct signals modification. Once it creates that, it creates box line rotation surface. Once it creates that, it creates data streams and set location line settings of data operations. Once it creates that, it creates platforms. And line direct signals to your cerebral cortex lines and visual keystone dimensions. That's what's going to be doing. So once a platitudes is line center, it's going to go through platforms of 2, 3, 4, and 5 set location. It's got to start identifying its setting to travel. Okay. So in that calculation line connections, the solar graph calculation line screen interference has a center line rotation and a 4-track 5 and 6 line connection. Okay. Puts lines of high center interference or point lines of settings. Okay, mapping sequence, coordinates, location, line connections of pi. Generates the screen line center interference into 3 lines of measure, 6 lines of position, 8 lines of track, and 12 line calculation. Now, as it comes in line center lines, connections, high centers, puts the lines at XT1000, routers, line rotations, cycles. generates the screen lines, a high adaptation line system. Position lines attractions and a two-line waving, xt thousands above and xt thousands below in line rotations of cycles generation. Setting communication line screens in high adaptation. Okay. So that's exactly what's going to happen with the Eclipse. Okay, it's going to create its modulation screen. It's going to create its own T reception line through its HDMI. So once you understand the higher definition, you understand line communication setting, probe location of smart TVs, systematic lines of its memory in line location to all levels of its awareness, coming into reminding you of television, the teleportation screen, directing lines modification, open up all cycles and high calculation settings and travel. Okay, that's how it's going to be set up, right? So it's creating its own modification lines of its teleportation. So when the moon basically crosses over, it's going to blend in. It's going to high correlate the calculation screen lines and create its own line setting, line rotations, and set locations into line communication of yin and yang. Okay, 2 provision line cycles, 1 line's attractions, 2 line division. Okay, so it's got to find its way in a continuous force. So nature has its resource, knows exactly what it is it's doing through its travels. So it has a continuous flow. It creates anomalies in settings. It has then its direct line settings that go forward and going backwards in a line connection setting and travel. Once it understands identification, the magnetic high wave formation line cycles changes everything through all calculation line settings. That puts position lines in set location, which is your clustrum, cluster lines of throw patterns, line direct signals, and modification. Directing modification line cycles, platforms, communication, line crossing. This is where you have to understand how to use it in line rotation cycles and generation screen lines of high adaptation. Patterns, lines of recognition, location grids, 12 lines of signals, lines of high calculation setting. Okay. So everything is set up in line provision. You just have to understand how to use it and all its attractions. This is going to open up all cycle location your settings to mystical cortex. Now, mystical cortex is like rings and rings and rings. You have an archetype line settings, earth line rotations. Okay, so lines, 2 track lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 set location. Direct modification lines, set lines of communication. Here's the moon. There's location. There's the sun, right? Projections over line screen, kaleidoscope communications, coming in line setting and set location. So what it is, the sun and the moon have to start identifying each other so they can really get into the formation of yin and yang. This is the process where you come into the spectral communication setting. So once the moon crosses over, it sets up an energetic low, screen lines high adaptation to a dimensional sail and set location. That's what happens. So it changes the spectrums of communications and settings, right? So it's a deeper core of the inner child. That's all it is. So the eye line division opens up patterns and lines of spectrums of your stargates and set location of travel. Directs modification lines of circles, line rotates the cycles, line generations of Pluto, in-line rotation cycles, identifications into I9, 6, sets lines of calculation line interference, into I9 line position, into 8 line rotations of cycles, and direct signals of panels. Okay? So time streams of pi correlation lines attractions opens up clusters and line settings and suffocation or galaxy line screen. Very complicated stuff, guys, but it's powerful once you start to identify what's going on with you, how an eclipse comes in formation. So it's going back and front at the same time. So what it's doing, it's releasing all filters of design of box lines, the theta line rotation surface, and a triangulation line connection setting in position to its operation. Okay, that's what's going to happen for the eclipse. All right, so it's all based on you. It's all connected to your DNA. You just have to understand the process, how this all works. Better communication in your line screens puts everything in a formation set locations, right? So the team lines is 19,000 on the line. Okay. Okay, so it's a 3 line zeros, zero line rotations, 0.00. That's where they are in attractions, right? Correlation line condition setting is 5, 6, 7, and 8. Equals lines of dimension, equals lines of dimension, equals lines of dimension, equals lines of dimension, right? Equals lines of Earth, equals lines of Earth, equals lines of Earth, equals lines of Earth, into 2030 in set location. Okay, so 5,000 line channels. Okay, 6,000 line channels. Okay, 7,000 line channels and 8,000 line channels. Okay, inside location of the mind. Okay, that's how it's set up. Okay. The process of communicating 19,000 line screen interference, the team's ready to go into the holographic screen line communications, passing lines, and location mystical line connections, putting spectral communication lines. We're coming at 7 solar flares now. It's a body temperature reading. This sets up the barometers and thermometers into your geolines location near storms. Directed modifications into your geographical system, mapping sequence, mapping pi, over lines, over pi, over rotation, over cycle. Directed modification cycles generate line interference because we're going to have a platitude line screen interference. We're going to have a huge test coming up. In line condition your settings into crop circles, I set location. How to use the crop circles. In 2030, of 19,000 line square roots. Now your position lines is going to go into 24. Okay, that routes the routers and line rotations to your inhibitors and the location of your settings. Putting position and track lines in your 48,000 lines of frames. Direct lines of data process communication setting, starting with 2,500,000 line screen. So in line rotations, you can set a 25 cycle, set up a 28 cycle, you can set up a 29 cycle, and a 33,000 cycle. All through clocking line condition settings. But you have to understand the perimeter line screen interference when it comes into acceleration lines of particle interference case of time center. That opens all communication settings. So you have to start identifying line rotation cycles in communications and settings of face recognition. Okay? Now that's what you guys are coming back to, is your face lines. But you have to understand what's going on in line rotation. All through spectrum, communications, and your eye cycles. Directing lines and line center interference, identification I9 is of 6. Allocates lines of the sun in position location moon line, sets lines in infinity line rotations. I9 is 8 is the team. I9 6 is identifications of species line, right? So systematically changes the I line calculation screen lines. Identification lines of 9 lines, puts everything in correlation to name track lines. Direct modification line condition setting and travels. Once we get into 24 line cycles, line condition lines of 25,000 line cycles, puts this line at 25,000 equals lines of 50,000 line cycles, puts lines attractions in all line rotation cycles and generation screen lines, adaptation cycles, and generation. Okay? So full clocking system, okay? So we got 15,000 lines of all calculation line connections, right? So 50 calls and calculation lines of formation screen. Adapts the system line conditions at all levels of its program into calculation A lines equals lines of LC in levels in lines of communication into timestamps, box line frame, and position of travel. Now that position line is its point lines attractions, generates the screen line's highest center interference, and position its operation. All right, so line center locations, you take the 15 line conditions of settings of calls, 3 track line provision, 4 settings and travel. Okay. Puts lines in the cerebral cortex lines of design. This allocates position of time frames and line condition settings of programs and direct signals. Modificates the cycles, generates line screens, box lines, triangulation line rotation, surface, and triangulation position of programs, and a 3 set location. Okay? So your time measures changes location line condition your settings. It's all about understanding your binary relines, your transistors and resistors. So basically what the sun and the moon are doing, guys, they're just formatting their yin and yang in their eye receptor division. This puts them in the mystical cortex lines, the inner child. The inner child is metaphorically designed for you to understand its structure. Okay, that's all it is. And once you understand the structure of the inner child reaches the deeper core of what the inner child really is to the representation to that setting, these applications, right? To you, what's your identification? And once you start recognizing that, everything gets much easier in process. You understand the process, the communications, the line settings, the triangulation resets, the program locations, the allocated time centers. You get a better communications when you're looking through provision. It's your perceptions, changing everything in calculations to its mystical cortex of design. Okay? So again, there's so many ways of looking at this, but there's only one way, is within. Okay? This modifies all levels of you. And once you understand that, all that information is you in traction. It's very powerful to recognize these things, how you start seeing, how you start hearing and communicating with your inner child on a mystical line. Okay, you start with the mythical, but the mythical and line condition setting is all lines of communications of what in settings. Box frames, triangulation frames, all lines of location your imaginations. Imaginations turn in that equals lines of location of phenomena. So in that line position locations, once the moon surfaces back and forth, it recognizes its position location of projections. The I division line cycles change the spectrum line connections. This is where we come into colossal interference. Now the colossal interference is cosmic interference. So it's all about understanding the cosmic of you, the cosmos of you, the mystical cortex of you, the placebo cortex of you, okay, the cerebral cortex of you. Okay, so the more you understand you through identification, the more you understand in setting line connections. All right, there's not two sides of the coin, there's three: past, present, and future. Okay, there has to be in everything in line connection setting. And once you start identifying that through identifications, you're always going to see your timelines changing so fast in online communication settings. So all you have to do now is just basically understand you more in a line deeper core of a mystical setting in set location your settings. It's put you in line connection to your dragons, better communication your settings, unicorns, anything through Pixie, anything formation of gnomes, anything through alliance underlying interference. You have to come into that identifications now because that is what's in scene. The center correlation setting that travel lines to your perception is really understand what you're seeing through a box frame, time interference, time calculations, times clocking. So this is going to help you in all ways and forms how to see yourself in a higher communication of dimensional lines of scales, balancing this and balancing that, understanding this, understanding that, taking all communication line connections. So when the moon surfaces through the sun, it creates a dimensional sail through the solar sail, correlation setting attractions. It comes into balance of yin and yang. Now that puts all lines of clarity and focus and gets you guys out of blurry, where you can't see through the eyes, your connections of your glasses and it's raining and the windshield wipers. Well, it's a full cycle line rotation cycle, right? So it's cleansing everything in line connecting your settings and travels, your eye receptor locations. So you start identifying yourself of the windows of souls of you and everybody else in time frame. But you have to really understand how this all works in line position location identification code screens. Puts lines of calculation line centers into a dimensional sail of a solar track location and all line centers, high line rotations in infinity 8 and high position travels in correlation setting attraction. Okay, that's all it is. That's all the sun and the moon is doing, right? So once it finds the balance, the center aligns its communication of its flywheel and set location of center. Once it understands that, it understands its mystical cortex line design. Remember, everything is inside position earth perception. You got a 3-track line setting locations, right? Grounds, powers, atmosphere, okay? That's the central system in line settings. So line position your sun and moon comes in line communications. Sets up new flux capacitor in a 3-way split. Sun and the moon come together in set location, right? So they're always in position to its location, right? So once you understand that, then you go through the platforms. It gets much easier to line communication in your settings, the higher levels of dimensionalized space, galaxies, multi-layers, dimensional layers, galactic layers, mega layers, anything in the dimensionalized a high calculation setting of travels. Platforms of communications, as long as your flywheel is in direct set locations to its modification screen lines, the adaptation system is all calculated modified. So you have Earth 1 line rotations in a 24, set position of 12, set position of 6, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, all through reference. Okay, to the line setting comes into a memory, muscle memory. Okay, so the old paradigms of the Earth, after 150 frequency, it leaves, but it comes back attractions into your memory cortex, which is a direct signal to the hippocampus that reframes everything in your past of a muscle memory, right? Set locations, right? So nothing is really destroyed. Okay, just transferred and evolve, revive, and reveal. Okay, so you look at nature in a different way. You look at the resources of nature in a different way. You look at everything in computer line in a different way. You start to identify the mystical cortex of everything around you through its identity that helps you understand through its awareness of consciousness that what you're looking at is everything in set locations. Okay, its mystical side of its setting, which is its inner child. So that's what you guys are coming into right now. Okay, that's what it is when it comes into spectrum communications, when it comes into your eye divisions. To understand how this is all set up in line condition settings of 2030 and set design. Okay, so there you go. That's how it's all set up. Yeah, you just got a better communication in your dragons. Like I said, it's a deeper cord to the inner child, but you have an HDMI, which is higher definition into models, into mind of identification. That's what it means in tractions. I9 of 6 and I9 of 8. Getting that lines at high center interference and in position for its calculation of its operation. Okay? All right, that's it. Pretty short and sweet, but we'll go into more identification line screen interference. I'll get you guys set up in your holographic cities and set design so the species understand the lines of communications. When they start looking at through perceptions, they start seeing the mystical line condition setting of its computer operation location and pixelation all through its hologram. Okay? Adios, everyone.